where I covered the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the eastern section of the front line centered around the Donetsk region in favor of the Russians. The Russians have managed to advance in the western parts of the city of Pokrovsk, as well as the northern flank of it. They're also advancing further north along their breakthrough that happened over the past 24 hours, where their advances are slowing down as they now need to consolidate these positions they have breached. While Deep State Map says and states that they continue advancing forwards, it is still at a slower pace compared to earlier, as they now have to consolidate their positions and build up their positions for further advancements. Otherwise, they would be leaving themselves vulnerable to Ukrainian counterattacks. And Ukrainian counterattacks there will be, as the Ukrainians have redirected the 1st Azov Army Corps to defend against this breakthrough and resettle the situation on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, as it is completely out of hand for the Ukrainian forces. The current situation, the Ukrainians are now attempting to stabilize the situation before launching counterattacks to regain control over the northern flank of Pokrovsk and continue the battle over the city itself. The Ukrainians holding the city would not matter if the Russians end up gaining control over Dobropilya and other cities in the northern flank of Pokrovsk. Therefore, the Ukrainians have redirected forces not just from the eastern section of the front line near Toretsk, but also from the Liman section of the front line, the Kupiansk section of the front line, and Sumy region, where they are spreading out the areas from which the reinforcements are arriving from to not weaken any one area too much. However, this means that in general the Ukrainian front line will be weakened to strengthen their defenses in the vicinity of the city of Pokrovsk. The Russians also continue their advances in the Liman direction, both in the northern and eastern flank of the town. Starting out on the western flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to advance within the town of Odashne, gaining control over the southern parts of it, leaving just the northwestern parts and central parts in the northern direction of the town remaining under Ukrainian control. The fighting over Odashne has been very tough for both sides, as the Russians have been attempting to gain full control over the town, while the Ukrainians have been working to prevent the Russian capture of it. The importance of Odashne lies within the close proximity to the coal mine here west of the city. As we have seen throughout the war, any industrial zone is very well fortified in terms of warfare. This means that the Russians gain control over the coal mine will allow them to have a heavily fortified outpost for their forces to operate from. And the close vicinity to the railway area and highway, the E50 highway that connects to Pavlorad, would come under Russian fire control. This means that one of the last remaining highways would be cut off to resupply Pokrovsk. The main supply line of Pokrovsk right now is the Pavlorad highway, which connects from the city of Pavlorad, which connects to the city of Dnipro, all the way to Pokrovsk. The Russians getting closer and closer to the capture of Odashne would open up the road for the coal mine, which would then allow for fire control over that highway. It will also allow the Russians to secure the western flank for a push towards the city of Pokrovsk from the TO406 highway that leads from the Zaporizhia region into Pokrovsk. The Russians having additional supply routes into the city will allow them to strengthen their positions on the outskirts of it, and to have additional supply lines inside of the city would limit the Ukrainian capabilities to strike the Russian supply lines into it. The defining factor of the sieges over cities throughout this war has been how many roads either side controls into it. The Russians now control one road into Pokrovsk, while the Ukrainians control 2 roads. The close vicinity to Rudenske and the Russians cutting off the highway in the north would limit this to 1 road that leads into Pokrovsk, while the Russians are closing in on gaining control over 3 roads that lead into Pokrovsk, the one to the southeast and the one to the southwest of the city. If the Russians then gain fire control over the last road leading into the city, then the power balance will switch completely in favor of the Russians for the capture of both Pokrovsk and Mirnorad. The Russians are working their way towards the 20406 highway that leads into the western parts of Pokrovsk. The Russians are working to gain full control over it, which will allow them to have an additional supply route into the city from the western flank, gaining control over the fortified positions northeast of Kotliny and in the western parts of Pokrovsk. Will allow them to have a secure supply line into the city, also allow them to connect their forces to physically cutting off the E50 highway further north along the forest lines and fortifications leading up to the northern flank. Gaining control over the western flank of Pokrovsk would cut off the last remaining supply routes that the Ukrainians have into the city, while strengthening their own logistics into the city. On the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians continued advances within Chervony Liman on the southern flank of Rodinske and have managed to gain a foothold in the eastern parts of the city. The foothold achieved and the industrial area captured, as well as the waste heap east of Rodinske, all allowed the Russians to establish themselves in the northern, eastern and southern flanks of Rodinske, where fighting is taking place over the control over the city, which is located adjacent to the main highway north of Pokrovsk. Gaining control over Rodinske, the industrial area west of Rodinske, will completely secure the Russian control over the northern highway, which they already have fire control over, especially with the recent advance northwest of Rodinske, gaining control over fortified positions and their infiltration way beyond the highway. However, the Battle of Rodinske has just begun. Rodinske itself has several apartment complex buildings. It's very difficult to gain control over the city for the Russians if the Ukrainians have a strong garrison of the city. If the Ukrainians do not, then most of the supply lines leading into it have already been cut off, which means the Russians would be able to quickly gain control of it. Depending on how prepared the Ukrainian forces were, the Russians can take weeks to gain control of it, or simply a few days. The Russians are racing against the clock as it stands due to the Ukrainian forces being redirected to this section of the front line. If the Russians are able to gain full control over Rodinske prior to the Ukrainian counterattacks, they will not just cut off one of the main highways leading into Pokrovsk physically, they will also be establishing a logistical hub for their own operations on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, from which they can cut off the highway leading into Pokrovsk from the northwest, from the northern direction. Also allow them to establish offensive operations in the direction of Belitske further north, which is a city comparable to Rodinske. Also allow them to establish logistics for their forces operating further north in the direction of Dobropilya, where they can advance both along the highway near Belitske and through the railway in the direction of Doroshne towards Dobropilya. Instead, if the Ukrainians are able to launch counterattacks, they can significantly delay the Russian capture of Rodinske or even cancel it completely, which would buy a lot of time for the Ukrainians in the northern flank of Pokrovsk. In the meantime, the Russians continued offensive operations in the northern direction, gaining control over Ektova Belka, which is a national park here north of Nikhanorivka, and fighting continues in the direction of Ivanivka, Novoshakhove, and all the way to Novye Donbass, where the Russian forces have infiltrated. In the eastern direction, the Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the southern parts of Volodymyrivka yet again. Following the capture of Benkivka and Mayak, the Russians restart offensive operations here in the eastern direction, where they're looking to continue their advances along the main fortified line of the Ukrainians through Volodymyrivka, Shakhove, and further north. The Russian advances here to the west continue in the direction of Kucherev Yar, where the Russians have already established themselves in the eastern parts of the town. The Russians are slowly advancing from the southern direction to gain control over the waste heap south of Kucherev Yar, which overlooks the town, gaining control over which will allow them to establish and secure their positions in the northern flank in the direction of the towns of Vesele and Solotyi Kolotyasi. The Russians are continuing their fighting over both that town, Rubishne, Vodiane, and Petrivka in the northwestern direction to cut off the highway that connects Dobropilya here in the southwest with Kramatorsk in the northeast. Cutting off the Kramatorsk-Dobropilya highway, while at the same time cutting off the Pavlorad-Pokrovsk highway, will completely isolate this section of the front line from any direct major supply lines. Instead, the Ukrainians would need roundabout ways to supply these directions. This means the redirection of forces and reinforcements being sent to the northern flank of Pokrovsk will also be delayed due to the Russian advances. Further northeast, the Russians continue their defensive operations in the direction of Liman, both to the northwest and to the east of the town. The Russians managed to gain control over the southeastern outskirts of Torsk, gaining 100% full control over the town, and fighting continues over the Serbiansky forest area, where the Russians are looking to gain full control over everything east of the Serbitsa river line. At the same time, the Russians continue their offensive operations in the direction of Shandriholova and Serechne, where the Russians are looking to gain control over both settlements, which will allow them to cut off one of the 3 roads that supplies Liman from the northwest. The Russians are now close to the road itself, as they've managed to gain a foothold in the eastern parts of Shandriholova and gain full control over the farm area to the east and northeast of the town. The Russians also managed to advance along the forest patch area in between both towns, looking to infiltrate the central parts, cut off the highway that connects the northern and southern settlements. The Russians are very close to gaining full control over Serechne, with over half of the town under Russian control, which will allow them to strengthen their positions on the western flank of Shandriholova, isolating it from the main supply routes and allowing them to gain full control over that town as well, to further springboard their offensive operations in the southern direction to cut off additional roads leading into Liman from the northwest. In the northern section of the front line within the Sumy region, there's not been a lot of movement. The main movement has been Ukrainian counterattacks. Following the recapture of Kindrativka and Andrivka, the front has been somewhat stabilized. The Russians are slowly attempting to gain full control over Nikivka to establish themselves within the Sumy region with a logistical hub for further offensive operations. With the redirection of Ukrainian forces from different sectors of the front line to the Pokrovsk direction, it is likely that the Russians will strengthen their offensive operations in other directions, which means we'll likely see additional Russian movement here in the Sumy region, as well as in the Kharkiv direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operations to gain control over Kupiansk, Liman, in the northern flank of Donetsk, and in the Kharkiv region. And we are also seeing reports of the Russians strengthening their offensive operations in the direction of Zaporizhia by redirecting forces from Berdyansk and Crimea to the Zaporizhia and Pokrovsk directions. The Ukrainian General Staff expects the Russians to strengthen offensive operations into the Dnipropetrovsk region from the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and into the Zaporizhia region in the south. This is all to take advantage of any Ukrainian redirection of forces from other sectors to the Pokrovsk section. The Russians are sending additional reinforcements to face off against the Ukrainian forces, while at the same time they are also pushing the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia and other sectors of the front line to punish the redirection of forces. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.